Afghanistan is a concern for the region and beyond. With me is EU Special Envoy on Afghanistan here in Delhi, who has had a number of conversations with officials. So welcome to WION. My first question to you is, what do you make of the situation right now in Afghanistan? It has been almost more than 1.5 years since Taliban takeover of Kabul.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be back in Delhi. The situation in Afghanistan is gravely concerning for Afghans inside the country and also for neighbors and countries further afield. First of all, there is no governance, there is no government in place recognized by the people or recognized by the international community. We have seen systematic violations of human rights, and the government in place, the de facto government in place, the Taliban, issuing various decrees restricting the freedom of movement, the rights of girls and women, clamping down on journalists and ethnic minorities and religious minorities being under threat. There is no constitution in place. The economy has diminished rapidly since the Taliban took over. And the security situation is deeply concerning, both inside the country in terms of growing threats from organizations such as ISIS-KP and others, but also neighbors are gravely concerned by the security situation. So we are now also in the middle of the winter with 28 million people in Afghanistan depending on humanitarian assistance. And at that precise moment, the Taliban decide to ban women from working for NGOs and INGOs, and by doing so, de facto restricting women's access and children's access to humanitarian assistance delivered by Europe, by the US, by India, and others.
How do you see India's role in Afghanistan? Earlier, India had very strong relationship with the Afghan Republic. India does not recognize the Taliban regime like the international community, but where do you see India's role?
I think it's clear that India has played a very positive role in Afghanistan over decades, and even longer. There are strong links between the people of Afghanistan and India. India invested generously in and provided development assistance. It was the biggest regional provider of assistance, and Afghanistan was the biggest recipient of assistance from India. So there is a lot of goodwill, there is a lot of history to build on. A lot of that changed when the Taliban took over and India decided to pull out. It pulled out its embassy staff, it closed down development cooperation. And I think India is now looking and trying to decide how to look at Afghanistan. Is it still a country that they can engage with? Will it build on the solid foundation laid? Will it look for ways to provide assistance? Or will it look at Afghanistan primarily as a security concern and through a security prism and trying to contain the negative impact of what is happening inside the country?
So recently there have been reports that many of the Gulf countries have been closing their missions, and there is a security alert. You talked about security. What is the reason behind it? If you can just talk about, is there a major security concern right now in Kabul that is the reason behind countries closing their missions?
We have seen since last summer a number of attacks against diplomatic missions in Kabul, against a Russian diplomatic mission, against a Pakistani diplomatic mission, against Chinese interests, against the Ministry of Interior Affairs and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it is clear that there is a serious security threat inside Kabul. This is deeply worrying for those who have presence inside the country, India having its technical mission in place, and others as well. I have been fully occupied by my mission here over the last few days. I seem to understand indeed that Saudi diplomats have temporarily left the embassy. I'm not sure for what reason. There's also been a lot of speculation about others leaving, which I understand are pure speculation at the time being. So I cannot comment on the precise situation right now, but I underline that overall there is a worrying security situation also in Kabul. And the Taliban try to, I think, do their best to protect diplomatic missions. But it is also clear that ISIS-KP's capacity seems to be building up and has been building up over the last 6 months or so.
Will you say that the missions should go out of Kabul, given, as you pointed out, the security challenges? When it comes to the Western diplomats who might be present in Kabul, do you think that they should also reconsider their presence in Kabul?
I think those of us who are present in Kabul find very good reasons to be there. We want to maintain contacts with the people of Afghanistan. We want to convey messages. We want to understand the situation. We want to facilitate the delivery of assistance, those of us who provide humanitarian assistance and other forms of assistance. So going out would be a difficult decision to take. It is luckily not a decision I will have to take, nor a decision I should advise on. You have to weigh in political and security issues, and that is a decision that each country will have to decide on.
So essentially, has the West and EU left Afghanistan on its own, given that you are already preoccupied by the situation in Ukraine? Essentially, the European politicians might not have the energy left to focus on Afghanistan, and it is just lip service coming from Europe when it comes to the words and rhetoric.
The troops, the NATO troops and allied troops have of course left Afghanistan. We, the European Union, have our diplomatic presence, a small presence in Kabul. We have a humanitarian office in Kabul. We have committed more than 400 million euros of assistance, which is far more than most regional countries have contributed. We also see, if you refer to the West more broadly, the US has contributed and continues to provide very significant amounts of humanitarian assistance. We stay engaged in talking both to Taliban and to other Afghans. So I think the perception or what you allude to of the West or Europe leaving Afghanistan is very far from the reality. We are present, we intend to stay, we intend to continue to provide humanitarian assistance, and we are deeply saddened and shocked by the decision by the de facto authorities to try to limit the access of Taliban's most in need to such assistance.
But Taliban is essentially doing what it was doing previously in 1996. It's a repetition which we are seeing. It's the same story, and it was in fact warned to the West that Taliban will go against its commitments. So when we talk about West, the current situation in Afghanistan is primarily because the Western troops left, the American troops left. So don't you think it's the West that betrayed the Afghan people?
It is obviously, I mean, in terms of the time frame and the sequence of things, yes, the Taliban took over after or immediately, shortly before, the Western troops left Afghanistan. Neighbours of Afghanistan have for years and sometimes decades called on Western troops to leave Afghanistan. We had tried together, beyond the humanitarian assistance and beyond the development assistance, also to build and prepare the Afghan national defense forces to defend the country, to stand up for the Islamic Republic. That didn't work. The president of the Islamic Republic left the country. I think we have to look back at 20 years of support for Afghanistan. We may also have to look back, further back in history, and look at who did what and who said what and what situation we're in today. But I think it would be far too easy to attribute blame only to one group of countries or to one specific country, as we sometimes hear. And my focus is very much on the situation we are in today. There will be a time to talk about history, but right now we need to focus on what we can do to provide assistance and support Afghans, 40 million Afghans who desperately need support.
So now coming to what Taliban has been doing, they have been taking measures when it comes to women's right. Essentially, women can't work. I know that European Union is obviously not happy. Many countries are not happy because this is something that is shocking in today's era. What can European Union do to make sure that the Taliban regime can reverse their decision?
I think change inside Afghanistan, change in Afghanistan has to come primarily from within the country. The European Union and other partners of Afghanistan and of the Afghan people can make clear our expectations. We can remind the Taliban of their obligations under international law. We can, of course, call on them to reverse decisions. But I think right now we are more in a situation, and we will do so. But right now we're also seeing what exceptions can be made. For example, when you refer to the ban on women from working at the development in humanitarian assistance in NGOs and INGOs, we can point out, excuse me, when it comes to the ban on women working for NGOs and INGOs, we will point out the consequences it can have if women cannot deliver assistance, if women cannot receive assistance. That will also have an impact on the type and the amount of assistance that Europe can provide. But again, change within the system will have to be driven from inside the country. There is a long history starting back at least with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and some would argue also with later foreign intervention, where trying to build a country and from outside is not doable, is not sustainable. And it will be, what we can do, I hope, is to help create the conditions for Afghans to take part and to push for change inside the country through peaceful means.
And do you also share the concerns of many countries, including New Delhi, that Afghanistan might become a safe haven for many terror groups? For India, the worry is the anti-India terror groups, which are essentially based in Pakistan, now moving to Afghanistan. So how big is this concern that it's again becoming the hub of international terrorism?
I think we can look at some of the facts, and it's not so much speculating about the future. We saw the presence in Kabul last summer of the leader of Al-Qaeda. We see ISIS-KP building capacity and carrying out attacks. We see TTP carrying out attacks inside Pakistan, and we have seen cross-border incidents also affecting other neighbors. So it's not so much that Afghanistan can become, it is more whether it has the capacity to change the current situation where they already harbor quite a number of jihadist or militant organizations. And that's also clear from our conversations here in India, that remains a primary concern of India and of many of its neighbors.
What were the conversations here in India, since you just pointed out to that?
The purpose of our visit is basically, and we are in regular contact with Indian counterparts, we try to understand a bit better and compare notes a little bit as you and I do today. What has changed since last time we met? How does India see Afghanistan? How does India see its role? Last time we were here in December 21, there was no presence of India in Kabul. Now there is a small presence, as we understand. India has also provided humanitarian assistance that was being negotiated when we were last here. But I think we also share severe concerns about the direction the country is going in terms of security and in terms of human rights and in terms of lack of any process leading to a more inclusive government.
India is hosting the G20 summit. It's the president of the grouping. Do you think, or have you suggested that New Delhi should be focusing on Afghanistan as well? I mean, we saw under the Italian presidency of the grouping a special session on Afghanistan, but that year we saw the regime change happening. Have you discussed that? Is India planning to do something like that on Afghanistan under its presidency?
This was not brought up in our discussions. I'm sure that the G20 agenda will be very full, and I understand that not everything circulates around Afghanistan. Although personally, of course, I find that what happens there is still hugely important. And my conversations with Indian counterparts confirms that to India, still, Afghanistan is a major issue. Then how the agenda is being set and how important it will be and whether the G20 is the right format, that's very much for the chair to decide on. And I'm sure they will make good choices.
There's another issue, that's the Afghanistan-Pakistan issue. Now, we know that both countries have been blaming each other. We saw the Peshawar terror attack, and then the Afghan side made comments, a lot of comments which the Pakistanis never liked. So, how do you see the situation which is evolving between Kabul and Islamabad, and what solution do you see that can happen given that Pakistan and Afghanistan share a pretty long land border?
I think it's fair to assume that Pakistan is deeply concerned by the security threats coming from Afghanistan. It was a tragic attack, of course, horrible in terms of victims in Peshawar, as you mentioned. And we have seen over the last few months also a number of other attacks inside the country claimed by TTP. So I think Pakistan is very much where other neighbors of Afghanistan is in terms of putting security as a primary concern. There have been attempts, as you know, to negotiate ceasefire. There was an attempt last year between the Pakistani government and TTP, the Pakistani Taliban. And understand that members of the de facto government played a role, notably members of the Haqqani network in that regard. I think the attack in Peshawar is likely to make the Pakistani establishment less willing to pursue that type of approach, and they may well be looking for alternatives. They are, like others, as I mentioned, very much concerned about the security, and I think also from the Pakistani side, working together with neighbors, if and when possible, in trying to prevent these type of attacks, trying to change the situation where, as I said, Afghanistan has become a relatively safe haven for many organizations, is in the interest of Pakistan, but also of the wider region.
You talked about the neighboring countries. I mean, we've discussed India and Pakistan, but there's Russia and China as well. And we saw recently Russia hosting the NSA talks. What's the role you see for Russia in Afghanistan, and also China as well? Because China has also signed a pact with Taliban when it comes to minerals. If you can talk about role of these two countries.
Well, Russia is, of course, not a neighboring country to Afghanistan. It is far away, and it has, from what I can see, not played a very constructive role. I don't see it contributing in terms of assistance. I don't see it contributing in terms of trying to find political solutions. At the same time, of course, they organize a number of regional format meetings in a rather exclusive circle, where they pursue their own agendas, of course. But Russia also has history, as we know, in Afghanistan, and there is some understanding of the country. And Russia, although not being a neighbor, I think also sees threats coming out of Afghanistan, and can perhaps also play a role in trying to address some of those. China, you refer to a number of deals, a number of commercial contracts regarding minerals and so on. We'll see how that will play out. It is a situation where it's, as I mentioned, there is no legal framework inside the country. The security situation is challenging. And I think that probably China's investment is seen in a long-term perspective, and that at least in the short term, very little is going to come out of it, neither for China nor for the Taliban in terms of income or job creation. Perhaps a little bit as we have seen in Balochistan, where you do not really see Chinese workers in any significant number, and where the jobs created are basically for Chinese workers coming in.
So my last question to you is, I know time is running out, much philosophical question, I would say, that Are you hopeful for the Afghans? Because as of now, you sitting in any capital in the region, outside the region, the visuals you are getting, the heartbreaking stories. I'm sitting here in Delhi, but I can tell you that I have a lot of Afghan friends, and they tell me stories, very bad stories. So, are you hopeful that Afghanistan will again come back to the normalcy or perhaps happier times in near future?
Talking about hope when you see 28 million people being dependent on humanitarian assistance, talking about hope when there is no responsible government in place, talking about hope when terrorism is building up, talking about hope when the neighbors are worried, would probably seem naive. In the medium to long term, yes, I'm hopeful. And the hope I have is in the people of Afghanistan, the enormous resilience, the capacities, the fantastic people. And there is a chance, after all, for them to take control of their country. I'm not talking about armed resistance. I'm not talking about a new civil war. But that in the long term, I'm absolutely confident that there will be a new future for Afghanistan. But I can also not be very optimistic about the near future, where I'm actually afraid that the situation will get worse. And I can only call on the Taliban to think carefully about the consequences their decisions are having for the people of Afghanistan. And I can call on India and others to do whatever they can, also to put the interest of the people of Afghanistan first, and continue, where possible, to provide the assistance needed to help the people get through the winter.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to WION. It was a pleasure having you with us, and of course, getting an idea of how you see the future of Afghanistan, the role the countries of the region can play. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking to WION. Thank you for having me.